The impossible mission. 23 B-17 bombers never came home on October 14, 1943, and the man who would save thousands more was scrubbing oil off his hands in a freezing hangar in England, completely unaware he was about to change the war. The mission to Schweinfurt had been a massacre. Of the 291 flying fortresses that crossed into German airspace that morning, 60 were shot down before sunset. That's 600 men, dead or captured, in a single afternoon. The numbers didn't lie, and they painted a picture that made grown generals want to weep. American daylight bombing was failing, and failing catastrophically. Sergeant Bill Anderson stood outside the operations building at RAF Debden, watching the survivors limp home. The P-51 Mustangs had escorted them as far as they could, turning back at the German border like obedient dogs reaching the end of their leash. Beyond that invisible line, the Luftwaffe owned the sky. He'd been working on Mustangs for 8 months now, and he loved these machines. Sleek, fast, deadly. But watching them return with full ammunition loads while bombers fell from the sky made him sick to his stomach. It wasn't the pilot's fault. They were pushing their fuel to the absolute limit, landing with tanks so empty, the engines sometimes quit on the runway. Anderson pulled out his worn notebook, the one his crew chief told him to stop wasting time with. Inside were columns of numbers. Fuel consumption rates, engine temperatures, mixture settings. Most mechanics just followed the manual. Anderson couldn't help himself. He'd grown up in Kentucky Hill Country, where his uncle ran an illegal still, and he'd learned early that the difference between good whiskey and poison was chemistry. Engines weren't so different. The math haunted him. A P-51 carried 269 gallons internally, plus two 75-gallon drop tanks. At standard combat settings, that gave them maybe 850 miles round trip. The manual was clear. Cruise at 2300 RPM. Mixture set to auto-rich for safety. Maximum continuous power for combat zones. Every pilot followed these settings religiously because deviating meant potential engine failure over enemy territory, and engine failure meant death or prison camp. But Anderson had noticed something during routine maintenance flights. When pilots accidentally leaned out their mixtures too much during cruise, they didn't blow their engines. They just traveled further. The Allison V1710 engine, later the Packard Merlin, was more forgiving than the manual suggested. That evening, he found himself in the officers' club, nursing a warm beer he'd traded half his cigarette ration for. Captain James Fletcher sat 2 stools down, staring into his whiskey like it contained answers. Fletcher had led his flight back from the German border that afternoon, leaving the bombers to face the wolves alone. "We need another 200 miles, Fletcher said to no one in particular. "Just 200 more miles and we could have stayed with them all the way to target." Anderson turned his beer bottle, watching condensation run down the glass. 200 miles. His numbers said it was possible, but saying so out loud would sound insane. The technical manuals were written by engineers with college degrees and years of testing. He was a dirt-poor mechanic from Kentucky who'd barely finished high school. "What if we're burning fuel wrong?" The words came out before he could stop them. Fletcher looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "Excuse me?" "The mixture settings. We're running auto-rich because the manual says so, but what if we don't need to? What if we could lean it out during cruise and save enough fuel for those 200 miles? You'd melt the cylinders. Every pilot knows running too lean burns up engines." "At full power, yes, sir. But at cruise, I've been watching the numbers. We're dumping fuel we don't need." Fletcher leaned back, studying him. "You know what happened to the last mechanic who modified engine settings without authorization? Court-martial. They found pieces of his pilot scattered across a French field." Anderson nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. But that mechanic was modifying spark timing. I'm just talking about mixture ratios during cruise. Nothing in combat, nothing aggressive, just efficient burning during the boring parts." "The boring parts over the English Channel where engine failure means drowning in freezing water?" "Better than what's happening now, sir. How many crews did we lose today? How many more tomorrow?" Fletcher's jaw tightened. He'd lost his wingman over Bremen 2 weeks ago. Good kid from Michigan, engaged to be married. The Luftwaffe had jumped them right after the P-51s turned for home. "Even if you're right, which you're probably not, who's going to authorize this? Colonel Blakesley would have your stripes. General Hunter would have you digging latrines until the war ends. What if we tested it? Quiet-like. 1 plane, 1 flight, just to see if the numbers work. That's a court-martial for both of us. Sir, with respect, they're already dying. If we do nothing more, die tomorrow. If I'm wrong, you can turn me in yourself. But if I'm right..." Fletcher finished his whiskey in one swallow. The ice cubes rattled in the empty glass. Outside, Another formation was landing, engines coughing, fuel gauges reading empty. Somewhere over Germany, Luftwaffe crews were celebrating another turkey shoot. "One test," Fletcher finally said. "One unauthorized maintenance flight. If your engine quits, you were never involved. If it works, we take it higher. And Anderson? You better be right, because I've got a wife in Ohio who'd be pretty upset if I die testing some hillbilly's moonshine theory." Anderson felt his heart hammering. He'd just convinced an officer to risk both their careers, possibly their lives. But the alternative was watching more bombers fall from the sky while their fighter escorts turned back, slaves to fuel consumption rates that might be wrong. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, going over the calculations again and again. The chemistry made sense. Running leaner meant more complete combustion, less wasted fuel, lower cylinder head temperatures if done correctly. The risk was detonation if you went too lean, but there was a sweet spot. There had to be. Through the thin walls of the barracks, he could hear someone crying. Probably one of the ground crew who'd watched his pilot's plane go down over Schweinfurt. 23 planes. 230 men. The numbers kept getting worse. In 72 hours, he'd either prove the manual wrong or become another cautionary tale about mechanics who thought they were smarter than engineers. Either way, the war was about to change for Bill Anderson. He just didn't know yet that his stupid idea would eventually save thousands of lives and help win the air war over Europe. The moonlight came through the barracks window, and somewhere in the distance another formation was taking off for a night mission. The Merlin engines sang their familiar song. Soon, if Anderson was right, that song would carry American fighters all the way to Berlin and back. But first, he had to survive tomorrow's unauthorized test flight. The ridiculous experiment. The test flight was scheduled for 600 hours, disguised as a routine engine break-in after maintenance. Fletcher would take P-51B serial number 43-112434 up for what the logbook would call standard post-maintenance evaluation. What the logbook wouldn't mention was the modified fuel mixture settings Anderson had spent all night calculating. Anderson arrived at the hard stand while stars still filled the sky. His hands shook as he stenciled the new mixture ratios onto a card, then thought better of it and burned the paper. This had to be memorized. If something went wrong, there could be no evidence. "You look like hell," Fletcher said, appearing from the darkness with his flight gear. "Didn't sleep much, sir." "Neither did I. Walk me through this one more time." Anderson climbed onto the wing, opening the cockpit. Normal takeoff and climb, auto-rich mixture like always. Once you level off at cruise altitude, you manually lean the mixture until you see a slight RPM rise, then enrichen it just a hair. That's the sweet spot. Cylinder head temps should actually drop, not rise. And if they don't drop, then you enrichen immediately, and we forget this conversation ever happened. Fletcher settled into the cockpit, the leather seat creaking. "Your uncle really made moonshine? Best in Harlan County, sir, until the revenuers caught him." "Wonderful. I'm betting my life on bootlegger chemistry." But Fletcher was smiling slightly, the grim humor of men who lived close to death. The Packard Merlin coughed to life, settling into its distinctive growl. Anderson stood by the wing, watching gauges over Fletcher's shoulder. Everything normal. Oil pressure good. Coolant temperature rising steadily. Just another test flight. Nothing to see here. Fletcher taxied out as the sun broke over the English countryside, painting the clouds orange and gold. It was going to be a clear day, which meant bombers would fly and men would die. Anderson watched the Mustang accelerate down the runway, graceful and deadly, then leap into the air like it was meant to live there. Now came the waiting. He lit a cigarette with trembling hands, then threw it away after one drag. His stomach couldn't handle it. Instead, he paced, checking his watch every 30 seconds. The flight plan called for a 2-hour test. 90 minutes in, Fletcher would radio with a simple code. Sunshine meant success, rain cloud meant failure, and silence meant Anderson should start packing his gear for the stockade. In the ready room, he tried to busy himself with paperwork, but the other mechanics noticed. "What's got you so jumpy, Andy?" Corporal Martinez asked. "You look like you're waiting for a telegram from your girl saying she married the mailman." "Just tired. Long night." "We're all tired. This place runs on tired cigarettes and coffee that tastes like motor oil." The radio squawked to life with routine traffic. Weather updates, formation positions, a bomber crew reporting engine trouble over the channel. Normal war noise. Anderson's watch showed 70 minutes elapsed. Then Fletcher's voice crackled through. "Debden Tower, this is Mustang 434, requesting extended pattern. Sunshine looking good up here. Repeat, sunshine looking good." Anderson felt his knees go weak. Martinez looked at him strangely. "You okay? You just went white as a sheet." "Fine. Just remembered I forgot to sign off on something." He practically ran to the hard stand. Fletcher was already on approach, the Mustang dropping gracefully toward the runway. The landing was smooth, professional, and the engine note sounded healthy as Fletcher taxied in. The moment the propeller stopped spinning, Fletcher was out of the cockpit, pulling off his helmet. His face was flushed with excitement. "You crazy hillbilly genius. It works. It actually works." The temps dropped 15 degrees once I found the sweet spot. Fuel consumption was at least 20% better than manual specifications. "Anderson, do you understand what this means? We flew the exact same profile as last week's test, and I landed with 45 more gallons than I should have had." Anderson did the math in his head. 45 gallons at normal consumption rates. That's almost 200 miles, sir. That's Berlin. That's every target in Germany. That's the whole damn war changing. But Fletcher's excitement faded as reality set in. "Problem is, we just conducted an unauthorized modification test. I falsified the flight log. You modified engine parameters without engineering approval. By the book, we're both screwed." "So we don't go by the book, sir. We go to someone who cares more about winning than regulations." "You mean Colonel Blakesley?" Donald Blakesley was a legend, the kind of combat leader men would follow into hell armed with nothing but harsh language. He'd flown Spitfires with the RAF before America entered the war, shot down 16 German aircraft, and had exactly zero patience for bureaucratic nonsense. He was also known for ending careers of officers who wasted his time. Fletcher considered. He could court-martial us both before breakfast, or he could give us permission to test it properly. "Sir, you said it yourself. It works. The numbers don't lie. How many pilots would volunteer to test this if it meant saving bomber crews?" "All of them. But that's not how the military works. There are procedures, safety boards, engineering reviews. This could take months." "How many men die in months, sir?" Fletcher's jaw tightened. He'd been at Schweinfurt. He'd seen the empty chairs in the officers' club that night. "Get me every scrap of data you've collected, every calculation. We're seeing Blakesley this afternoon, and you better be ready to explain this better than you've ever explained anything in your life." The meeting was set for 1400 hours. Anderson spent the morning writing everything down in his neatest handwriting, double-checking every calculation. His hands still shook. This wasn't fear of the Germans. This was fear of facing a colonel and saying the engineering manuals that governed every aircraft in the Army Air Forces might be wrong. Martinez found him in the hangar. "Whatever you're into, Andy, be careful. Scuttlebutt says Fletcher got called to the colonel's office. Usually means someone's getting their ass handed to them." "Yeah, probably. Look, I don't know what you did, but you're a good mechanic. Don't let them railroad you over some paperwork." Anderson nodded, not trusting his voice. Martinez meant well, but he had no idea this was about something bigger than paperwork. At 13:55 hours, Anderson stood outside Colonel Blakesley's office, his folder of calculations clutched like a shield. Fletcher was already inside. Through the door, he could hear raised voices, though not the words. Then the door opened. Fletcher's face was unreadable. "He wants to see you." "And Anderson?" "Tell the truth, all of it. He already knows about the test flight." Anderson's heart dropped into his boots. He walked into the office feeling like a man approaching the gallows. Colonel Blakesley sat behind his desk, a cigarette burning in an ashtray, his eyes sharp enough to cut steel. He didn't invite Anderson to sit. "Sergeant, Captain Fletcher tells me you've been running unauthorized engine tests based on bootlegger chemistry and a hunch. He also tells me it worked. Before I decide whether to pin a medal on you or have you digging latrines, explain to me exactly what you did and why I shouldn't court-martial you both right now." Anderson swallowed hard. His entire military career, possibly his freedom, hung on the next few minutes. He opened his folder with sweating hands. "Sir, with respect, I believe our P-51s can fly 200 additional miles on their current fuel load. I believe we can escort our bombers all the way to any target in Germany and bring them home safely, and I believe I can prove it." Blakesley leaned back, eyes never leaving Anderson's face. "You've got 10 minutes, Sergeant. Make them count." The fate of thousands of airmen, and perhaps the air war itself, rested on a Kentucky mechanic's ability to convince a legendary colonel that sometimes the manual is wrong. The court-martial Risk Anderson spread his papers across Blakesley's desk, his voice steadier than he felt. The calculations stared up at him, numbers that could either save lives or end his career. "Sir, the Packard Merlin runs at a 14.7 to 1 air-fuel ratio at auto-rich. That's what the manual specifies for safety margins. But during cruise flight, at reduced power settings, we can safely lean that to approximately 16 to 1, sometimes even 17 to 1, depending on altitude and temperature. Blakesley stubbed out his cigarette. In English, Sergeant. We're feeding the engine more fuel than it needs, sir. Like putting too much wood on a campfire. Sure, it won't go out, but you're wasting wood. During cruise between combat zones, we can burn leaner and stretch our range significantly. And the engine doesn't eat itself? No, sir. Captain Fletcher's cylinder head temperatures actually dropped. Leaner mixture burns more completely, generates less waste heat. The danger zones are at full combat power or if you go too lean. But there's a window, a sweet spot, where everything works better. Blakesley picked up Anderson's flight data. Fletcher says you gained 45 gallons worth of range. That's substantial. That's Berlin and back with reserves. Yes, sir. That's every target the bombers need to hit. That's also unauthorized modification of military aircraft, falsification of maintenance records, and conducting dangerous experimental procedures without proper safety oversight. Blakesley's voice went cold. You understand I could have you both in the stockade by dinner time? Fletcher stepped forward. Sir, with respect, we just lost 60 bombers in one mission. The mathematics work. The test flight proved it. How many more crews die while we wait for proper channels? Captain, I appreciate your passion, but we have regulations for reasons. Engines fail. Pilots die. If we start letting mechanics modify specifications based on hunches, we'll be scraping our best men off French countryside. Anderson felt the moment slipping away. Sir, may I ask a question? Blakesley's eyes narrowed. You're already in enough trouble, Sergeant. How did you shoot down your first German aircraft, sir? The office went silent. Fletcher looked like he wanted to strangle Anderson. Blakesley's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. What did you just ask me? Your first kill, sir. I read about it. You broke formation, ignored your flight leader's orders, and pursued a Focke-Wulf against direct commands. You said later that the book would have let him escape, so you trusted your instincts instead. That's insubordination, Sergeant. No, sir. That's doing what works instead of what's written down. With respect, sir, you've built your reputation on knowing when the manual is wrong. Fletcher had gone pale. Anderson had just compared a decorated colonel's combat decisions to unauthorized maintenance procedures. It was either brilliant or career suicide. Blakesley stood slowly, walking to the window. Outside, P-51s sat on hard stands, beautiful and deadly, and limited by fuel mathematics that might be incorrect. The silence stretched until Anderson wanted to scream. My first kill got me grounded for 2 weeks, Blakesley finally said. My commander told me I was a reckless cowboy who'd get good men killed. Then 2 months later, he recommended me for promotion because my reckless cowboy instincts had saved a bomber formation. He turned back. You're betting I'm still that same cowboy, Sergeant. I'm betting you care more about winning this war than following procedures that kill our airmen, sir. Careful. You're about 2 sentences away from latrine duty regardless of how good your math is. Fletcher interjected. Sir, give us 1 week. Authorize controlled tests with volunteer pilots, full instrumentation, safety observers, proper documentation. If it works, we implement it across the group. If it fails, you can court-martial us both and use us as examples. And if an engine fails during testing? If a pilot dies because we're experimenting with fuel mixture over hostile territory? Then that's on me, sir, Anderson said. Put it in writing. Captain Fletcher followed my recommendations. I take full responsibility. Blakesley returned to his desk, lighting another cigarette. You know what the generals will say? They'll say we're risking aircraft and pilots based on the theories of a sergeant who never finished high school, developed in secret, tested without authorization, and presented as a fait accompli. Yes, sir. They'll say we're cowboys playing with fire, gambling with lives because we think we're smarter than the engineers who designed these aircraft. Yes, sir. They'll probably be right to say all of that. Blakesley exhaled smoke. Which is why we're not telling them until we have irrefutable proof. Fletcher, you've got 1 week. I want 6 test flights, different pilots, full range of conditions. Every flight gets documented down to the last detail. Anderson supervises all mixture modifications personally. Any pilot volunteers, but they get full briefing on risks. Clear? Crystal, sir. And Sergeant, if this works, I'll recommend you for a commendation. If it fails and kills someone, I'll personally make sure you spend the rest of this war counting rivets in Alaska. Dismissed. Outside the office, Fletcher let out a breath he'd been holding. That was either the gutsiest thing I've ever seen, or the dumbest. Probably both, sir. You compared a full colonel to yourself. You basically called him a hypocrite to his face. I called him consistent, sir. There's a difference. Fletcher shook his head, almost laughing. 1 week to prove this works. We need 5 more pilots crazy enough to volunteer for experimental fuel procedures. That proved easier than expected. By sunset, 12 pilots had volunteered. Word had spread about the potential range increase, and every pilot who'd watched bombers fall beyond their escort range wanted in. The hard part was choosing only 5 for the test program. Lieutenant Robert Chang was first. Chinese-American from San Francisco, quiet but brilliant. He'd studied engineering before the war. "Show me the math," he said, and spent 2 hours reviewing Anderson's calculations before nodding. "It's sound. When do we fly?" Captain Vincent "Vinny DeLuca" was next. Brooklyn accent thick enough to cut with a knife, 23 kills to his name, and a reputation for bringing damaged aircraft home through sheer stubbornness. "You're telling me we can stick with the bombers all the way? When do we start?" Lieutenant James Harrison III, old money from Boston, flew with mathematical precision. "The fuel calculations are elegant, almost beautiful. I'm in." First Lieutenant Tommy Wilson from Texas drawled his acceptance. "My brother flies B-17s. Anything that keeps him alive, I'll test." And Lieutenant Sarah Jennings, one of the women Air Force service pilots attached to the unit for ferry duty, pushed her way into the group despite regulations against women in combat. "I've got more hours in P-51s than half your combat pilots. You need a test pilot who'll follow procedures exactly." "That's me." Fletcher initially refused. "WASP pilots aren't authorized for this type of test." "Then make it a ferry flight. I'm testing the aircraft. What I do with the mixture settings during a routine ferry mission is maintenance protocol." She stared him down. "You need precise by-the-book test methodology. I'm your best pilot for that." She was right, and Fletcher knew it. The test program began at dawn the next day. Anderson personally briefed each pilot, walking them through the procedure step by step. Lean the mixture gradually. Watch the cylinder head temps. Feel for rough running. Enrichen immediately at any sign of problems. Chang went first. A 3-hour flight that covered the equivalent distance to Stuttgart and back. He landed with fuel to spare and a huge grin. Cylinder head temps stayed in the green the entire time. Fuel consumption was 22% below manual specifications. DeLuca's flight the next day reached even better numbers. "It's like the engine wants to run this way. Smoother, cooler, just drinks less gas. This ain't black magic, this is just smart flying." Harrison provided the most detailed technical analysis, recording temperature and pressure readings every 5 minutes. His report ran to 6 pages of dense engineering notes that concluded, "The procedure is not only safe but optimal for cruise flight operations." Wilson's flight simulated combat conditions, alternating between cruise settings and full combat power. Switching back to auto-rich for combat is instantaneous. No lag, no problems. We can cruise lean and fight rich. Jennings flew the final test, a grueling 5-hour mission that pushed the P-51 to its absolute limits. She landed as the sun set, taxiing in with precision, and climbed out of the cockpit with her flight log showing numbers that made Anderson want to cry with relief. "It works," she said simply. Every system remained within operational parameters. Total range increase of 218 miles over manual specifications. "Gentlemen, you've just changed this war." Blakesley reviewed all 6 test reports that evening. Anderson stood at attention, waiting for the verdict that would either vindicate everything or destroy him. The colonel looked up from the final page. "Sergeant Anderson, against my better judgment and all military common sense, you appear to have been right. Captain Fletcher, prepare to brief the entire fighter group. We implement this immediately." "Sir, what about command approval?" "Engineering review." Blakesley's smile was wolfish. "We'll ask forgiveness instead of permission. The bombers fly to Berlin next week. Our fighters are going all the way with them. Let the generals court-martial me afterward if they want. At least our boys will come home." Anderson felt the weight of the past week lift. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. But the real test wasn't in controlled conditions over England. The real test would come when Luftwaffe fighters discovered American escorts over targets they'd calculated as impossible to reach. That test was coming soon. The day Germany's calculations failed, March 4, 1944, began like any other mission day at RAF Debden, except for the unprecedented distance marker on the operations board. The target was Berlin, the Reichshauptstadt itself, the heart of Nazi Germany. Major Klaus Hartmann of Jagdgeschwader 26 received his morning briefing at Wunstorf Airfield with complete confidence. The German intelligence officer pointed to a map marked with concentric circles showing Allied fighter ranges. "The American bombers will have P-51 escort to approximately here." The officer indicated a line well short of Berlin. "Beyond this point, they are unprotected. Standard procedure." Our western units engage the escorts and drive them off. Eastern units wait here, where the Mustangs must turn back. The bombers will be defenseless for the final approach and egress. Hartman nodded. He'd flown this pattern a dozen times. The Americans were predictable. Their fighters always turned back at the same point, slaves to fuel mathematics that German intelligence had calculated to the kilometer. After that, the flying fortresses belonged to the Luftwaffe. How many kills did we get on the last deep penetration raid? Someone asked. 41 bombers. The Americans are brave but foolish. They keep trying to reach targets their fighters cannot protect. Across the North Sea, Anderson watched 60 P-51 Mustangs taxi into position. Every aircraft had been personally inspected. Every pilot had been briefed on the new fuel procedures. Every mechanic knew that today would either vindicate everything or prove they'd been catastrophically wrong. Fletcher found Anderson by the lead aircraft. You sure about this? The tests don't lie, sir. The math works. Tests over England are different from combat over Germany. If these engines start failing deep in enemy territory, they won't. You sound more confident than you look. Anderson managed a weak smile. I'm terrified, sir, but I'm terrified of the right things, not engine failure. I'm scared we waited too long. Scared of how many men died before we figured this out. The mission commander's voice crackled over the radio. All Mustang flights, this is Bluebell Leader. Today we make history. Today we show the Luftwaffe that nowhere in Germany is beyond our reach. Remember your fuel procedures. Stick with the bombers. Bring everyone home. The Mustangs lifted into the gray English morning, forming up over the channel. Behind them, over 300 B-17 flying fortresses assembled into their combat boxes, their crews knowing this was the deepest they'd ever penetrated Germany. But for the first time, they had a promise of escort all the way. The formation crossed into German airspace at 8:47 hours. Luftwaffe fighters rose to meet them, Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s diving through the bomber formations. The P-51s engaged, the sky filling with tracer fire and engine noise. This was the moment when the escorts usually had to break off. Fuel calculations demanded it. Every pilot watched their gauges, knowing the mission profile called for them to continue, but years of training screamed at them to turn back before their tanks ran dry. Bluebell Leader, this is Bluebell 4, approaching normal separation point, fuel showing good, continuing escort. That was DeLuca's voice, steady despite the chaos. Hartman watched from 25,000 feet as the American formation approached the line where the escorts always turned back. Any moment now the Mustangs would peel away, and his Gruppe would fall on the bombers like wolves on sheep. But the Mustangs didn't turn. They kept coming. Hartman checked his tactical map, confused. The Americans were well past their maximum escort range. This was impossible. They'd calculated these ranges precisely, studied captured fuel tank specifications, interrogated prisoners about consumption rates. The P-51s couldn't be here, but they were. Achtung! Enemy fighters at Angels 2-5, continuing escort beyond maximum range. His wingman sounded as confused as Hartman felt. They must have drop tanks we didn't account for. Engage and destroy. The Luftwaffe fighters dove to intercept, expecting to find fuel-starved escorts desperate to disengage. Instead, they found fully capable Mustangs ready for combat. Lieutenant Chang spotted 3 Messerschmitts positioning above the bombers. His training took over. Auto-rich mixture for combat power. Throttle forward, wings level, fire. The lead 109 exploded, debris tumbling through the bomber formation. The other 2 broke hard, but Chang stayed with them, his engine running perfectly at full combat power. No hesitation, no fuel anxiety, just fighting. Wilson got on the radio. This is Bluebell 8. Just splashed 2 bandits east of Magdeburg. Fuel looking good. I got enough gas to chase these bastards back to their airfield if needed. Across the formation, similar scenes played out. Luftwaffe pilots found themselves fighting American escorts over targets they'd assumed were beyond fighter range. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Hartman fired at a B-17, scoring hits on the number 3 engine, but 2 Mustangs appeared from nowhere. He dove away, checking his own fuel. The dogfight had dragged him far from his base. But these Americans had flown from England, fought for 20 minutes, and showed no signs of leaving. All units break contact and return to base. The Americans have extended their range somehow. Reform for defensive positions. The order came from Gruppe Command, and it tasted like ashes in Hartman's mouth. For the first time in the war, Luftwaffe fighters retreated while American bombers still approached their target. The bombing run on Berlin was chaotic but protected. German flak filled the sky, but without sustained fighter attacks. The bomber formations held together. The P-51s weaved above them, still ready, still dangerous, still impossibly present this deep into Germany. Lieutenant Jennings found herself alone for a moment, her flight scattered during the engagement. She checked her fuel gauge and allowed herself a small smile. The numbers Anderson had promised were holding true. She had enough fuel to reach Berlin, fight, and return home with reserves. A Focke-Wulf appeared from cloud cover, lining up on a damaged B-17 struggling to keep formation. Jennings didn't hesitate. She pushed her throttle forward, her Packard Merlin responding instantly, and positioned herself between the German fighter and the bomber. The German pilot saw her coming and made a choice. He broke off, diving away rather than engaging. Even the aggressive Luftwaffe pilots were becoming cautious now, uncertain about these American fighters that shouldn't exist this far from home. On the ground at German fighter bases, intelligence officers frantically revised their calculations. Something had changed. The Americans had somehow extended their range by at least 200 miles. New defensive strategies needed immediate implementation, but those strategies would take weeks to develop. Today, the bombers reached Berlin, dropped their loads, and turned for home with full fighter escort. The return journey was almost anticlimactic. German fighters made half-hearted attacks but broke off quickly. The Luftwaffe's carefully calculated defensive strategy had crumbled in a single morning. As the English coast appeared through the haze, pilots started checking in. Fuel gauges showed exactly what Anderson had predicted. They'd flown to Berlin and back with reserves to spare. Blakesley's voice came over the radio. "Outstanding work, Bluebells. Every bomber is accounted for. Every fighter returning. Today we proved something the Germans thought impossible. Tonight, we celebrate. Tomorrow we do it again." The landing at Debden brought cheers from ground crews. Anderson stood by the hard stand, watching his pilots return. Each successful landing validated everything. Each safe touchdown was a victory over mathematics that said it couldn't be done. Fletcher climbed out of his cockpit, removed his oxygen mask, and walked straight to Anderson. He extended his hand. "Your crazy hillbilly theory just changed this war. The Luftwaffe knows it. They're scrambling right now, trying to figure out what we did. By the time they understand, we'll have air superiority over all of Germany." DeLuca was next, his Brooklyn accent thick with emotion. "We stuck with the bombers the whole way. The whole damn way. Do you know what that means? Those bomber crews came home because of you." Chang provided technical data. Fuel consumption was within 2% of test flight predictions. Cylinder head temperatures remained optimal throughout. The procedure is validated beyond any doubt. Wilson was more direct. "My brother's crew flew today. They made it because we were there. Thank you." Even Jennings, proper and precise, showed emotion. "Sergeant Anderson, I've been flying since I was 16. I've never seen anything as elegant as watching German fighters retreat because they didn't believe we could be there. You didn't just solve a fuel problem. You broke their entire defensive strategy." That evening, Blakesley called Anderson to his office. The colonel had a bottle of whiskey on his desk, 2 glasses poured. "Drink, Sergeant. You've earned it." "Sir, I don't think I'm allowed to drink with a full colonel." "Today you are. Today you're the man who changed how we fight this war." Blakesley raised his glass. "To mechanics who think, pilots who trust them, and commanders foolish enough to let both of them prove the manual wrong." They drank. The whiskey burned, but it was good burning. "Sir, what happens now?" "Now? Now every fighter group in the 8th Air Force gets briefed on your procedures. Now the engineers analyze what you discovered and make it official. Now we take this war to Germany's doorstep, and we don't leave until it's over." Blakesley refilled the glasses. "And now, Sergeant Anderson, you get a promotion and probably a medal. Can't have a sergeant making colonels look bad. I just wanted to help, sir. You did more than help. You saved thousands of lives. The men who'll survive because of your work. Most of them will never know your name. But I'll know. The pilots will know. And that's enough." In Berlin, Klaus Hartmann sat in debriefing, trying to explain how American fighters had appeared 200 miles beyond their calculated range. The intelligence officers didn't believe him until every pilot reported the same impossibility. The American escorts had gone all the way to Berlin. The calculations were wrong, and the war in the air had fundamentally changed. Legacy written in vapor trails. By June 1944, every P-51 unit in the European theater operated using Anderson's fuel mixture procedures. What had started as an unauthorized experiment by a Kentucky mechanic had become standard operational doctrine. The manual itself was being rewritten. The impact on the air war was devastating for Germany. Luftwaffe defensive strategies, built on precise calculations of American fighter range, collapsed. Bomber losses dropped from 25% to less than 5% on deep penetration raids. German fighter pilots, once confident predators, became hunted prey in their own skies. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Anderson stood on the cliffs overlooking the English Channel, watching an armada of aircraft stream toward France. Thousands of bombers and fighters, all using the extended range techniques that had seemed impossible just months before. The sky belonged to the Allies now, and that ownership would prove decisive in the invasion's success. Master Sergeant Anderson, he reminded himself. The promotion had come through in April, along with a Bronze Star he didn't think he deserved. Blakesley had pinned it on personally, telling him that false modesty was unbecoming. The citation mentioned innovative technical solutions under combat conditions, without specifying what those solutions were. Some secrets stayed classified. Fletcher found him there, watching the aerial parade. He'd made major and commanded his own squadron now. Thinking profound thoughts, Andy. Thinking about Schweinfurt, about those 60 bombers that didn't come home, wondering if we'd figured this out sooner. Don't do that to yourself. You can't change the past. You can only improve the future, which is exactly what you did. Still feels like we were late. Maybe. But how many crews have made it home since because of what you discovered? Thousands. Literally thousands of men are alive because a hillbilly mechanic questioned the manual. Anderson smiled slightly. You ever gonna let me forget the hillbilly part? Absolutely not. It's the best part of the story. The story had spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. Every fighter group knew about the crazy mechanic who'd proven the engineers wrong. Some versions were accurate. Others had grown fantastical in retelling. Anderson preferred the quiet truth to the legend. What he didn't know, couldn't know yet, was how the story sounded from the other side. Former Luftwaffe pilot Klaus Hartmann, interviewed in 1978 for a documentary, remembered the day everything changed. We called it Der Schwarze Tag, the Black Day, not because of losses, though those were heavy. Black because suddenly the American fighters were everywhere, all the time, at every target. Our intelligence had guaranteed us safe zones where their escorts could not reach. In one day, those zones vanished. We went from hunters to hunted overnight. He paused, shaking his head. We found out later it was a fuel mixture modification. Something simple. We had the same engines under license, could have done the same thing. But we followed the manual precisely. The Americans, they questioned everything. That difference perhaps decided the war. Another German pilot, Johann Weber, was more blunt in his 1982 memoir. The day the Mustangs reached Berlin, I knew we'd lost the war. Not politically, not strategically, but mathematically. They'd solved a problem we didn't know could be solved. After that, it was just a matter of time. But in summer of 1944, Anderson didn't think about historical legacy. He thought about the next mission, the next improvement, the next way to bring more boys home alive. The war ground on. Anderson's techniques spread beyond fighters. Bomber formations adjusted their cruise procedures, gaining range and efficiency. Transport aircraft carrying paratroopers to Arnhem used modified fuel settings. Even reconnaissance aircraft flying deep photo missions over Germany benefited from the extended endurance. The engineers eventually figured out what Anderson had discovered through intuition and moonshine chemistry. Lean of peak operation during cruise flight provided optimal thermal efficiency and reduced fuel consumption without compromising engine longevity. Technical papers were published. Training manuals were revised. The procedure that had nearly gotten Anderson court-martialed became Aviation 101. By late 1944, Luftwaffe resistance was crumbling. The war everyone knew would end eventually was clearly ending soon. Anderson found himself training new mechanics on the procedures he'd developed, watching kids fresh from technical school learn techniques that had started as forbidden experiments. One young corporal, barely 19, asked him during a training session, "Sergeant, is it true you invented this whole system in a secret lab?" "No lab, just a notebook, some observations, and too much coffee." "But you went against orders, right? Risked everything?" Anderson considered the question carefully. "I risked my career to potentially save lives. When you make that calculation, the math gets real simple. Some things are worth the risk." "Would you do it again, knowing you could have been court-martialed?" "Every single time." The European War ended in May 1945. Anderson was at Debden when the announcement came through. The mechanics and pilots gathered in stunned silence, then erupted in celebration. It was over. They'd won. Fletcher found Anderson alone in a hangar that night, sitting on a workbench, looking at a P-51 that would never see combat again. "You okay?" "Yeah, just thinking. That's a lot of flying hours on that aircraft, a lot of missions, a lot of chances for something to go wrong. But it didn't. Your procedures worked every single time. 0 engine failures attributed to fuel mixture modifications. That's not luck, Andy. That's brilliant engineering. It was just chemistry. Nothing brilliant about it. Tell that to the 2,000 bomber crewmen the statisticians estimate survived because of extended fighter escort. Tell that to the pilots who flew those extended missions and came home. Tell that to their wives and kids and parents." Anderson looked at the aircraft, its aluminum skin reflecting workshop lights. How many missions? How many times had this particular Mustang escorted bombers deep into Germany and brought its pilot home safely? The maintenance logs would have numbers, but numbers didn't capture the reality of lives saved. "What happens now?" Anderson asked. "What do we do when there's no more war to fight?" "We remember. We teach. We make sure the next generation understands that sometimes the manual is wrong, and sometimes a mechanic from Kentucky sees what trained engineers miss, and sometimes breaking the rules is exactly the right thing to do." Anderson shipped home in July 1945, carrying his Bronze Star, his promotion, and memories of a time when simple chemistry had changed the course of aerial warfare. He never spoke much about his role. When asked about the war, he'd talk about the pilots, the crews, the teamwork. He deflected praise with practiced ease. In 1983, an aviation historian tracked him down to a small garage in Lexington, Kentucky, where 68-year-old Bill Anderson still worked on engines. The historian wanted to interview him for a book about innovations in World War II aviation. "Mr. Anderson, you fundamentally changed how fighter aircraft operated. Your contribution saved thousands of lives. How does that feel?" Anderson wiped oil off his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. "I fixed a fuel consumption problem. That's what mechanics do. We find things that don't work right, and we fix them. But you went against official procedures, risked court-martial, challenged established engineering doctrine. The procedures were wrong. Men were dying. Seemed like fixing it was more important than following rules that didn't work. If you could go back, what would you tell your younger self in 1943? Anderson considered this, looking at the modern engine he'd been tuning. "I'd tell him to trust the math, trust the chemistry, and never let regulations stop you from doing what's right, especially when lives are on the line." Any regrets? Just one, that we didn't figure it out sooner. Every bomber crew that went down before we implemented the changes, those weigh on me. Could we have saved them if I'd been smarter, faster, more confident? You can't blame yourself for that. Can't help it either. You see, the funny thing about saving lives is you always wonder about the ones you missed, the missions before you figured it out. The men who died while you were still scribbling calculations in a notebook. But thousands survived because of what you did. Yeah, I try to focus on that. Most days it works. The historian's book was published in 1985, detailing Anderson's contribution. By then, modern aviation had moved far beyond carbureted piston engines and manual mixture controls. Jets ruled the skies, but pilots still learned about fuel management, efficiency, and the importance of questioning established procedures when observation suggests something better. Bill Anderson passed away in 1991, quietly, in his sleep. His obituary in the Lexington Herald mentioned his Bronze Star and his service. But most readers had no idea they were reading about a man who'd fundamentally altered the course of World War II. The P-51 Mustangs he'd worked on sit in museums now, polished and preserved. Plaques describe their combat records, their victories, their role in achieving air superiority over Europe. Few mention the fuel mixture procedures that made their extended range possible. Fewer still mention the Kentucky mechanic who figured it out. But among aviation historians, among old pilots who flew those missions, among the families of bomber crews who came home safely, the story persists. The mechanic who questioned the manual, the man who trusted chemistry over regulations, the hillbilly genius who looked at fuel consumption rates and saw lives that could be saved. In the end, Anderson's legacy isn't written in medals or official citations. It's written in vapor trails across German skies, in bombers that made it home, in children who grew up with fathers, in a world freed because someone dared to ask, what if the manual is wrong? That question, and the courage to seek its answer, may have been the most important innovation of the entire air war. Sometimes the difference between victory and defeat isn't technology or tactics. Sometimes it's one person willing to trust their calculations over conventional wisdom, risk everything on being right, and refuse to accept that impossible is the final answer. Bill Anderson never saw himself as a hero. He was just a mechanic who fixed a problem. But the 2,000 men who came home because of that fix knew differently. They knew exactly what he was, even if he never did. He was the man who made the impossible routine, the unauthorized authorized, and the stupid fuel mix the smartest decision anyone made in the entire air war. And that made all the difference.